If you've ever walked through the English countryside and thought, this could use more green children, congratulations, you might be Woolpit material. In the warm haze of medieval England, around the year 1150, a mystery unfolded so weird, so oddly adorable, and so uncomfortably hard to fact-check. It's baffled historians, folklorists, and sleep-deprived Reddit theorists ever since. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Also, comment your location and what time it is right now. I'm genuinely curious which time zone this rabbit hole finds you in. Anyway, let's talk about the Green Kids, sometime during the reign of King Stephen, or maybe Henry II, because record-keeping back then was sort of like playing telephone through a fog. The sleepy farming village of Woolpit, nestled in Suffolk, got a visitor. Well, two actually. And they were green. Not metaphorically green, like new to town, or environmentally conscious. We mean literally, leaf-colored, pea-toned, little sprouts. It was a sunny harvest day. Locals were busy collecting wheat from the famous wolf pits that gave the town its name. Woolpit maar stargerd Wolfpit, because medieval branding, when two strange children emerged from a nearby pit, or possibly the woods, depending on which chronicler you believe. A boy and a girl, barefoot, dazed, speaking in no language anyone could understand, and dressed in weird, metallic-looking clothes that didn't match the 12th century peasant catalog. And again, just to be clear, they were green. Imagine you're a medieval farmer. You've got a hard day of bread, mud, and smallpox ahead. And suddenly, Shrek's kids show up in matching outfits, babbling like glitching Sims. What would you do? Well, the villagers did what any good feudal community would. They panicked slightly, then brought the kids to the local lord's manor house. This was likely Sir Richard de Calne, the landowner in charge at the time, who presumably had the best chair in town and the most soup. Sir Richard, bless him, didn't burn them as witches, which feels like a win for 1150. Instead, he tried to help. But there were problems. First, the children wouldn't eat. The villagers offered them meat, bread, even the local staple of pottage, which is basically medieval minestrone with fewer tomatoes and more sadness. The green duo refused it all. Now, one thing you learn when reading medieval accounts, people were very suspicious of folks who didn't like their food. If you turned down boiled turnips in the 1100s, you were either possessed, poisoned, or French. Eventually, after what must have been several awkward and increasingly desperate dinner attempts, the kids saw some green beans in the garden and got visibly excited. They devoured them raw shells, and all like they'd been reunited with a long-lost snack from another world. The villagers, meanwhile, probably looked at each other and said something medieval-sounding like, "Oh, good. They're bean people." The boy, sadly, didn't do well, whether from illness, shock, or a mysterious medieval condition nobody today can fully diagnose. He grew weaker by the day. He barely spoke, not that anyone could understand him anyway, and though he eventually nibbled more foods, he never really recovered. After only a few weeks, he passed away. No clear cause, no known name, no next of kin. Just a strange, green boy with wide eyes and a story no one would ever get to hear. That left the girl his sister, presumably. She was stronger, more curious, and apparently had a will to adapt. Over time, she began to learn English. Slowly at first. One word here, another there, and what she started saying, well, it changed everything. Now, here's a quick historical sidebar. This whole account comes down to us from two sources: Ralph of Coggeshall, an abbot with an eye for spooky stories, and William of Newburgh, a monk who doubled as a gossip columnist for strange events. They both recorded the tale a few decades later. So yes, there's room for medieval embellishment. But even skeptics agree something weird did happen in Woolpit. Back in the manor, as the green girl recovered and learned to speak, the villagers started asking questions. Who are you? Where did you come from? Why are you green? Her answers were not helpful in the way you'd expect. She claimed they were from a place called St. Martin's Land, a dim, sunless world where everything looked like perpetual twilight. Everyone was green there, she said, and they lived underground. Yes, underground. Now, to be fair, medieval England was already full of folklore about hidden folk, hollow hills, and subterranean kingdoms. But this wasn't some poetic fairy tale. This was a girl who said she literally walked out of a tunnel with her brother, following the sound of bells, and emerged into a field of bright, blinding sunlight. It was so dazzling that they collapsed, disoriented. She said they got lost after wandering away from a herd their father had sent them to watch. One moment they were in twilight. The next they were in Woolpit. Boom, time jump, light, humans, panic. Historians have a field day with this account. Some believe the tunnel was metaphorical. Others think it might have been an old mine shaft. And of course, there's the ongoing debate. Was this a real historical event, an exaggerated fable, or some deeply misunderstood refugee crisis? Meanwhile, the green girl who would later be baptized and named Agnes slowly lost her green tint over time. Once she ate normal food, her skin began to return to a more expected shade, which probably made dinner conversations a little less tense. Still, imagine the sheer weirdness of it all. Two kids appear in a wheat field like NPCs spawned by a buggy game engine. One dies. The other grows up speaking in riddles and references a place that literally doesn't exist on any map. And to this day, no one can fully explain where they came from. But we're just getting started. Because while this section ends with Agnes settling into English society, like a bizarre exchange student, the mystery, it only gets deeper. After all, if you suddenly showed up from a twilight world of green people, wouldn't you at least pretend you were joking? Unfortunately for history, Agnes never laughed once. She ate beans, turned pink, and spoke of wormholes. Medieval Tuesdays. Man, the people of Woolpit were used to weird. This was medieval Suffolk. After all, where diseases had personalities, wolves were still a legitimate threat, and a strong wind could be blamed on the devil or your neighbor, depending on the smell. But even in a world built on superstition, this green girl was a different flavor of unsettling. She was quiet, oddly observant, like someone who'd read the instruction manual for life but found the illustrations deeply confusing. She'd sit by herself, tapping her fingers rhythmically against stone walls, watching chickens with a strange intensity, as if trying to decode them. And the village, bless its gossipy little heart, didn't quite know what to make of her. Some believed she was a fairy. Others whispered she was a witch. One particularly drunk farmer declared she was the Pope's niece, gone moldy. That guy wasn't invited to many things after that. Sir Richard de Calne. However, the lord who had taken the children in remained curious. He didn't toss her into a dungeon or force her into servitude, which already put him ahead of 70% of his peers at the time. Instead, he made a sincere attempt to raise her like a normal English girl, albeit one with a permanent question mark floating above her head. Agnes began to eat more than just beans, bread, apples, and even that suspicious thing medieval folks called meat all found their way onto her plate. Her green tint faded slowly, first to olive, then to a pale jaundice, and eventually something that passed for healthy peasant pink, which in 12th century England basically meant alive, and not actively oozing. The villagers were fascinated. Was it the food? Was it sunlight? Or was she just molting? And this is where we get our first little brush with science, albeit of the retro kind. Fast forward to modern times, and we now know that extreme malnutrition, especially iron deficiency, can sometimes give the skin a greenish hue. A condition called chlorosis, nicknamed the green sickness, often affected young girls in pre-modern societies who were anemic and underfed, not glowing green like a Marvel character, but enough to look pale, yellow-green, and unwell. So yes, a modern doctor might squint at Agnes and say, "Feed her spinach and get her out in the sun." But that doesn't explain everything. Not the language, not the clothes, and definitely not the tunnel from Twilight. Once she could speak English fluently, she elaborated, slowly, carefully, and with what multiple chroniclers described as sincerity. She wasn't spinning bedtime stories. She was reporting a reality that, to her, made perfect sense. She said her people all lived underground, in a land without sun. The light there was like twilight, forever dim. Everything glowed faintly, as if lit by moonlight trapped beneath the earth. And everyone looked like her and her brother, green-skinned, quiet, and gentle. They didn't know of England, or sunlight, or wheat fields. Their world was self-contained. The way she described it gave some listeners chills. She wasn't poetic. She was precise. And of course, the villagers took that precision and promptly started throwing ideas at it, like darts at a pub wall. Theory number 1. They were fairies. This was the go-to explanation for anything weird in 1150. Your cow gives sour milk, fairies. Your kid speaks in tongues, fairies. Your wife runs off with a monk. Definitely fairies. The idea of an underground world matched the Celtic belief in the Hollow Hills, home of the Fae folk, beautiful, strange, and not always friendly. The green skin fit. So did the disorientation in sunlight. But fairies weren't supposed to die of bean deficiency. Theory number 2. They were Flemish refugees. This one's less magical, but more practical. At the time, there were actual Flemish immigrants fleeing from political unrest in the East. Some spoke strange dialects. Some wore foreign clothes. And some local English folks weren't thrilled about it. There was even a massacre of Flemish settlers around that time near Bury St. Edmunds, not far from Woolpit. Maybe the children fled into the woods. Maybe they got lost. Maybe they were traumatized, hungry, and sick, and that made them green. But even if that theory holds weight, it's hard to square it with the details Agnes never let go of. The underground world, the twilight, the green people, the bells that led them away. She never said, "Oh yeah, just kidding. I meant Belgium." So, the philosophical debate that's lingered through the centuries is this: was Agnes confused or convinced? Do children invent wild stories to cope with trauma? Absolutely. But do they hold on to those same stories, word for word, until adulthood, even when there's nothing left to gain from them? That's what puzzles people. Agnes wasn't trying to be famous. She wasn't writing scrolls or holding TED Talks for monks. She lived a quiet life in the manor. By all accounts, she was sweet, if a bit aloof. When she grew up, she worked as a servant and eventually married someone from King's Lynn, a normal life. But she never changed her story. Now, here's your quirky, off-topic medieval fact of the section. In the same era, there were recorded cases of animals being put on trial, like actual trials with judges and witnesses. A pig in France was once convicted of murder. A rooster was tried for laying an egg. Compared to that, a green child claiming to be from beneath the earth almost sounds reasonable. Back in Woolpit, the villagers slowly got used to Agnes. Children teased her a little. Old women prayed for her soul, and one guy probably asked her to bless his crops with moonlight or something. But she never gave them answers they could pin down. She didn't ask to be a mystery. She just was. Years later, she would be remembered not just as a curiosity, but as the girl who somehow threaded her way through multiple worlds, childhood, tragedy, folklore, and history, and emerged with a life nobody could quite explain. And let's be honest, we all know someone like that. The kind of person who walks into your life wearing the wrong shoes, says something that makes no sense, and then disappears before you can figure out if they were brilliant or just weird. Agnes was that, but with fewer shoes and more bean cravings. And so, while the boy faded into a quiet grave and a forgotten name, the girl endured, a walking puzzle in a world that didn't have Rubik's Cubes yet. But here's the kicker, Agnes wasn't done talking. Because the next part of her story, it involves a place no one has ever found, a son no one's ever seen, and a little thing called St. Martin's Land. Hold on to your lanterns. Things are about to get darker. The village of Woolpit was no stranger to odd tales. It had, after all, earned its name from the literal wolf pits dug centuries earlier to trap roaming predators. Wolves were common enough back then that towns just casually installed lethal holes like medieval bear traps. You could fall into one on the way to church. That kind of hazard breeds a certain tolerance for weirdness. So by the time little Agnes started talking about her home St. Martin's Land, most villagers just kind of nodded along, like there's sure. Of course, there's a Twilight Kingdom under the soil. That tracks. But Sir Richard de Calne, ever the local gentleman scholar with access to monks and parchment, wanted answers, and Agnes was finally ready to give them. Once her English was strong enough, she began to describe the world she came from in consistent, careful detail. She never changed the core story, not even once. The place she called home was a land of eternal dusk, where the light was dim, and the sun never rose. The people there, including her and her brother, had green skin, and everyone lived in peace and quiet. There were no wars, no hunger, no wolves or wolf pits, just soft light, soft voices, and beans. Lots and lots of beans. Most of her people worshipped a saint named Martin, which is how the place got its name, St. Martin's Land. This was, of course, interesting. St. Martin of Tours was a real Catholic figure, popular throughout Europe during the Middle Ages. His feast day was celebrated in many parts of England, and he was known for his kindness to the poor and his symbolic cloak. So Agnes had somehow attached or genuinely believed her underground world was affiliated with this saint. Was that a linguistic mix-up, or a sneaky attempt by her subconscious to legitimize her story in a Christian framework? Welcome to the ongoing philosophical debate. Was Agnes adjusting her worldview to fit her new life? Or were fragments of her real past simply misunderstood through medieval filters? Because here's the weird part. She never described St. Martin's Land as mystical or supernatural. There were no monsters, no spells, no flying dragons. It was just different, dim, underground, green. According to her, she and her brother had been tending livestock. Yes. They apparently had cows in Duskville when they heard a mysterious bell-like sound. Following the chimes, they wandered into a cave or a tunnel, after walking for what felt like miles in darkness. They saw light at the other end, but instead of exiting into another part of St. Martin's Land, they emerged into blinding sunlight, into Woolpit. They panicked, collapsed, were found by villagers. You know the rest. And now, let's pause for a historical reality check. The concept of tunnels leading to other worlds wasn't new in 12th century England. Across Celtic and Anglo-Saxon traditions, there were myths of hollow hills, magical places entered through caves or mounds, where time moved differently and the laws of nature didn't quite apply. One could spend a day in a fairy mound and return to find a century had passed. You'd emerge older, confused, and maybe a bit off. Sound familiar? So maybe Agnes wasn't inventing anything. Maybe she was drawing from the same deep well of cultural folklore that England had always stirred. Or maybe she wasn't from this world at all. Let's throw in your quirky side note of the section. Did you know that, in the Middle Ages, people believed cheese could be used to test guilt? A piece of holy cheese blessed by a priest would be fed to suspects. If they choked on it, clearly they were lying. This was called the trial by cheese. Imagine modern courtrooms with craft singles and moral panic. Anyway, Agnes's description of St. Martin's Land captivated some, terrified others, and bored at least one drunk monk who expected dragons. But it also led scholars centuries later to dig deeper. Some believed she was describing an actual nearby village, viewed through the trauma filter of a displaced child. Others thought she may have been raised in some cloistered religious community, underground like an abbey with no windows, living off a restrictive diet. That might explain the green tint and the inability to process sunlight, but the bells, the cave, the livestock, too specific, too odd, too metaphorical. Over time, the story took on the shape of allegory. Philosophers saw it as a tale of rebirth, of spiritual awakening from the shadowy world of ignorance into the light of knowledge, a sort of medieval Plato's cave, but with beans. That said, there's no evidence Agnes had a philosophical agenda. Her story never wavered. She didn't embellish. She didn't revise. And she never wrote anything down, probably because literacy wasn't in her job description. But people remembered. Chroniclers like Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh recorded her words decades later, citing local oral accounts and conversations with witnesses. Of course. Each version adds a little seasoning. One says the children came from a cave. The other says a valley. One describes metallic clothing. The other just says strange fabric. Details blurred, mixed, and fermented like a medieval ale. Yet the core never changed. 2 green kids, underground world, twilight, bells, light, panic, Woolpit. And here's where things get especially juicy. Some researchers suggest the idea of a bell sound luring the children might be symbolic. Bells in medieval England were used for church services, emergencies, or calling people to gather. Could the sound have been real echoes from a far-off cathedral? Or did it represent something deeper, a call from one world into another? Because if you really wanted to stretch the theory into sci-fi territory, there's a school of thought, albeit filled with Reddit threads and conspiracy YouTubers, that Agnes and her brother were sliders, accidental travelers between dimensions. Maybe the bell was an auditory wormhole. Maybe the tunnel was a rift. Maybe the twilight world existed parallel to ours, and they slipped through a tear in reality. Or, maybe they were just 2 traumatized kids who got lost, were found, and the rest is history's weirdest game of telephone. Either way, the tale of St. Martin's Land has echoed for centuries. Not because of its size or scale. It's not a war, not a dynasty, not a miracle. It's because of its simplicity. 2 lost children, 1 story, and a mystery that still fits perfectly in the dark corners of your brain when the lights go out. And the best part, we still haven't figured out where St. Martin's Land would be, if it ever existed at all. But what if we told you someone actually tried to find it? Yaksa. Long after Agnes's story had faded into whispered village lore and the occasional tavern anecdote. You ever hear about the green kids from down Woolpit? There were those who simply couldn't let it go. Because somewhere between the girl's precise retelling and the eerie consistency of details over time, certain minds heard something different, not a fable, not a metaphor, but a breadcrumb trail. Which brings us to the most peculiar development in this already peculiar tale. People started looking for St. Martin's Land. Like, actually looking, not with maps and compass roses, necessarily, but with questions, field work, and in one case, a surprisingly aggressive shovel. The first semi-serious attempt came in the form of monkish record-keeping, not exactly Indiana Jones with a fedora, but earnest nonetheless. Medieval scholars from surrounding abbeys, particularly at Bury St. Edmunds, began to collect fragments of the story, cross-referencing oral accounts and scraps of parish records. They weren't looking for buried treasure or secret portals that we know of. But they did want to know if this Twilight Kingdom might be metaphorically real. You know, like purgatory with beans. One particularly bookish monk, known only by the nickname Elfric the Diligent, yes, really compiled references to sunless lands and strange travelers from folklore across England and Brittany. His conclusion, that there may be spaces not lit by God's sky, hidden beneath the blessed hills. A quote that sounds cool, but also suspiciously like he was sleep-deprived and terrified of root cellars. But then, centuries later, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the story of the Green Children made a comeback, thanks in part to antiquarians and amateur historians who rediscovered the accounts of Ralph and William. These gentlemen were basically the conspiracy podcasters of their day, except instead of microphones, they had powdered wigs and quill pens. One of these passionate obsessives was Dr. Charles Blundell, an eccentric Cambridge fellow who believed St. Martin's Land wasn't just real, but accessible. He theorized it lay beneath Thetford Forest, a dense woodland not far from Woolpit, riddled with ancient barrows, chalk pits, and Roman tunnels. So naturally, he tried to dig his way there. Let's pause for your required off-topic fun fact of the section. During this same period, England saw the rise of gentleman scientists who casually experimented with electricity by electrocuting themselves, frogs, and on one especially misguided day, a corpse wearing a powdered wig. That spirit of reckless curiosity, Dr. Blundell had it in spades. He didn't have a proper archaeological team, but he did have a handful of students, a spade, and a rather dramatic lantern. Over several months, they excavated parts of an old chalk quarry rumored to have deep vertical shafts. The local vicar was not amused, but Dr. Blundell remained convinced he was scratching at the roof of another world. He found exactly 0 Twilight Kingdoms. What he did find was a collection of ancient Roman tiles, a buried goat skull still wearing a rusted bell collar, oddly enough, and one very annoyed badger. Blundell eventually abandoned the dig, citing a sudden fear that he might fall through the earth entirely, a quote that either reveals a brilliant metaphor for obsession or a man who hadn't eaten lunch. Still, the hunt for St. Martin's Land didn't stop. Even in modern times, folklore enthusiasts, urban explorers, and paranormal hobbyists have visited Woolpit and the surrounding area, hoping to find evidence of something just beneath the surface. They rarely find much unless you count the local pub, which proudly serves green child ale and has a painting of 2 suspiciously adorable green toddlers near the bar. And yet, the idea persists, because, strangely enough, St. Martin's Land seems to be everywhere and nowhere. In every culture, in every era, there are stories of places that exist in parallel to our own. Not heaven, not hell, just sideways. The Greeks had Hades and the Asphodel Meadows. The Celts had Tir na Nog. The Japanese have the Kakario, a hidden spirit realm. Even modern physics teases us with theories of multiverses, alternate timelines, dimensions folded into the gaps between atoms. We can't prove them, but we can't disprove them either. So what if Agnes was one of those rare individuals who accidentally slipped through? That brings us, inevitably, to the wormhole theory, a favorite among late-night YouTube thinkers, and at least 3 PhD candidates who really should have switched to sociology. They propose that the cave the children entered wasn't a cave at all, but a tear in space-time, a breach, a tunnel between dimensions, and the bell sound. Perhaps the resonant frequency of a rift opening, the blinding light, a sun from our world, overwhelming to eyes adapted to something dimmer. Admittedly, this theory relies heavily on physics that would make Stephen Hawking roll over in his mathematical grave. But hey, we're talking about green children here, let's not get picky. The most tantalizing part, Agnes never recanted, never laughed it off, never clarified that she was just from the next village over. She grew into a woman, took a Christian name, found work, even got married, but she never stopped insisting she came from St. Martin's Land. And as anyone who's ever met a chronic liar knows, lies evolve. They grow grander, inconsistencies creep in, but Agnes's story stayed the same. Her words, relayed through multiple chroniclers, held a strange steadiness that has kept academics in a mild, twitchy panic for decades. They want to debunk her. They need to debunk her. But every time they do, something slips, a detail that shouldn't be there, a phrase that wasn't common at the time, a quiet sense that the girl truly believed it all. And so, we're left with this A-girl who wandered into the wrong world, or the right one. We may never know. But what if someone out there has already found the way back to St. Martin's Land? Maybe they just haven't returned yet. By the time Agnes reached adulthood, she had more or less become a functioning, reasonably inconspicuous member of society, which is a pretty big achievement for someone who once refused all food except raw beans and claimed citizenship in a twilight bean-based kingdom. She was baptized. She worked. She answered to Agnes. She even got married, reportedly to a man from the nearby port town of King's Lynn. That's right, Agnes, the girl from an underground, sunless land of green people, somehow managed to tie the knot and settle into small-town medieval domesticity. The dream, really. But let's not get too comfortable, because for all her surface-level normalcy, everyone who interacted with adult Agnes noted something a little off. Not bad. Not dangerous, just off. Like a song played slightly out of tune. Or a person whose thoughts are permanently 3 beats ahead of the conversation. There were whispers. Of course there were whispers. This was the Middle Ages, where gossip spread faster than the plague and often carried just as many side effects. Some said she still talked to herself in her strange old language when no one was listening. Others claimed she'd disappear into the woods at night, returning with mud on her feet and a haunted look in her eyes. Sir Richard de Calne, now older, grayer, and less inclined to entertain fey theories, still kept a cautious interest in her. He once reportedly told a visitor that Agnes is kind-hearted, but her eyes sometimes look past me. Whatever that means. It's not exactly a glowing review for brunch company, but maybe she was just misunderstood. It's hard to blend in when your first known memory is climbing out of a hole and being blinded by the sun. It's even harder when you've buried a brother no one remembers, who may or may not have been from a place no one believes exists. And here's where the story gets sneakily profound. Because as Agnes grew older, and her green-tinged childhood became a thing of local folklore, rather than front-page gossip, well, if villages had front pages, her presence morphed into something almost sacred, not holy, not divine, but symbolic. Like a living legend nobody wanted to admit they still didn't understand. Which brings us to the ongoing philosophical debate, TM, of this section. What happens to someone who lives with a truth nobody else accepts? Is that person enlightened or simply deluded? Are they a prophet in disguise, or just someone too deep in their own head to climb back out? Because despite the quiet life, Agnes never wavered in her origin story. It wasn't something she talked about often. But when asked by curious monks, wide-eyed children, or wandering scribes, she would repeat the same details. St. Martin's Land, the green people, the bell, the tunnel, the light, no embellishments, no additions, just quiet, unwavering recall. And here's your true historical tidbit of the chapter in medieval England. Oral storytelling was often considered more trustworthy than written text. Why? Because the act of memorization and repetition was seen as sacred, a living link between generations. So someone like Agnes, who could recite the same story for decades without variation, may have had more credibility than we give her credit for today. Sure, the monks eventually wrote it down, but the villagers, they remembered it. They passed it on. And every version they told had the same haunting core, a girl with green skin who came from somewhere else. Now, let's pivot for a second, because this story has an unexpectedly hilarious wrinkle. Agnes may have had a teenage rebellious phase. There's a passing mention in one account that, during her adolescence, she refused to attend Mass and instead sat in the woods, facing east, waiting for the silver twilight. Naturally, this caused a panic. The local priest reportedly tried to perform a blessing on her shadow. It did not go well. And here comes your quirky off-topic detail for the day. Medieval Europe had a genuine fear of leftovers from otherworldly places. There were laws forbidding people from using fairy silver, which was suspected to vanish at sunrise. People who returned from the woods too dazed or changed were often subjected to dousing, that is, getting dunked in holy water while being quizzed about the apostles. Imagine doing your own walk of shame. But it ends with a priest and a sponge. So Agnes staying weird. Not unusual. The real mystery is how she survived it. By all logic, she should have been exiled, or worse. Yet instead, she carved out a life, a quiet one. A life that suggests that maybe her strangeness wasn't just tolerated, maybe it was respected. And here's where the story gets creepily intimate. Some later accounts describe her as having an uncanny kindness. People would go to her with headaches, heartbreaks, and missing chickens, not because she was a healer or a prophet, but because she listened, as if she remembered what it was like to be lost in a world that didn't understand her. She once told a visiting nun, "It is not dark where I came from. It is only soft," a quote that has been analyzed by folklorists, poets, and one extremely enthusiastic Tumblr thread with over 40,000 likes. And yet, she never tried to return, never went looking for another tunnel, never asked to dig under the manor. Was it because she knew there was no way back, or because she never really left it behind? That's the quiet tragedy of Agnes. Not that she was strange, but that she fit in just enough to survive, while still carrying the memory of a world no one believed in. And somehow, that might be even lonelier than being completely alien. But don't worry, we're not done yet, because Agnes's story may have faded into domesticity, but her legend, that's just getting started. Turns out, she left more behind than a few cryptic quotes and a bean-heavy diet. She left footprints, tiny ones, in the margins of manuscripts, in chapel records, and in the dreams of some very confused historians. And if you thought Agnes the adult was odd, wait until you meet the people who spent the rest of their lives trying to prove she was real. If there's one universal truth about historical oddities, it's this: someone, somewhere, will absolutely ruin their social life trying to explain them. And in the case of Agnes of Woolpit, our sweet, formerly green, twilight-born mystery girl, the crown jewel of obsessive scholarship lands squarely on the head of one particularly determined man, Augustus Horatio Lambert. Now, if you've never heard of Reverend Lambert, that's because most people haven't. His Wikipedia page doesn't exist, and his biographer, his niece, gave up halfway through and became a beekeeper. But buried deep in the annals of 19th century curiosity is a tale of one clergyman who, after reading the Green Children account, became utterly convinced that Agnes's story wasn't just symbolic, it was historical fact, and so began a lifelong quest to prove the impossible. Reverend Lambert started modestly enough by collecting manuscripts. His small cottage near Norwich became a fire hazard of scrolls, folios, and extremely passive-aggressive letters to other historians. He believed, truly and fervently, that St. Martin's Land had once been a real place, a subterranean settlement, a lost people, possibly wiped out by floods, disease, or if he was feeling poetic sunlight itself, The Reverend's obsession was driven by a few things. 1. He loved puzzles. 2. He hated skeptics. And 3. He had what he called a personal resonance with twilight spaces, which is either a lovely turn of phrase or a Victorian euphemism for needing therapy. He began mapping every known cave system in Suffolk and beyond. He sent questionnaires to villagers, asking if their grandparents had ever encountered anyone unseasonably green. He attended geological conferences and interrupted them to talk about bean-based societies. He was not invited back, but what made Lambert truly dangerous as a researcher, that is, was that he had just enough actual scholarship to be taken semi-seriously. He could cite medieval texts. He could cross-reference translations of Coggeshall's Latin. He could spot forgeries in old estate ledgers, and he began to make people curious. He proposed that Woolpit was built over a collapsed subterranean settlement, possibly Roman in origin, whose inhabitants had been cut off for centuries. The theory was that these people had adapted to darkness, developed unique dietary needs, beans, and had gone slightly green from mineral exposure, possibly copper or iron-rich water sources underground, which, to be fair, isn't entirely impossible. There are real-world examples of humans living in near-dark conditions for generations, think mine workers, or certain remote cave-dwelling tribes, and trace metal exposure can alter skin pigmentation temporarily. So it's not completely wild. But Lambert didn't stop there. He began writing his own chronicle, The Verdant Testament, a proof of St. Martin's Land. It was 682 pages long, handwritten in slightly angry ink, and illustrated with little sketches of what he thought green children might look like, wearing Roman tunics and carrying bean baskets. Adorably terrifying. He sent his manuscript to every major university in Britain. Oxford returned it unread. Cambridge sent back a polite rejection. Durham may have used it to prop up a wobbly desk. Azus still. Lambert persisted. He believed Agnes was the last survivor of a forgotten civilization, and the fact that no one had found the others yet only meant they were very good at hiding. This brings us to one of his strangest and most tragically hilarious field experiments. In 1872, Lambert convinced a local stonemason to help him reopen a sealed tunnel under an abandoned church near Woolpit. The tunnel, he argued, had all the right clues: old Christian iconography saint. Martin was carved on one lintel, strange mineral growth, and allegedly the faint sound of bells when wind passed through. Let's be real, probably bats. But Lambert was undeterred. He descended into the tunnel with a lantern, 3 bean sandwiches, and a notebook titled Emergency Observations Should I Be Transported. He was back in 14 minutes, covered in cobwebs, convinced that he'd heard a voice in the dark that said, "You're late." Was it real hallucination, wind, and anxiety, all of the above? It doesn't really matter, because this marked the beginning of the Reverend's unraveling. His sermons became more abstract. Parishioners started to drift off. At one point he preached for 2 hours on the spiritual metaphor of chlorophyll. One elderly woman reportedly whispered, "If I turn green, tell my son I love him." Eventually, his bishop gently suggested retirement. Lambert took this as a sign proof that the church was suppressing knowledge of the subterranean faithful. He moved to a coastal town and spent his final years writing letters to newspapers under the name The Woolpit Witness. None were published, except one, in a very small, very confused gardening magazine. Now, here's your required quirky detail. Lambert's personal crest, which he designed himself, included a bean plant, a tunnel, and a Latin phrase that roughly translates to, "Let no green child be forgotten." That's not a joke. That's dedication. And yet, buried beneath the eccentricity, his work left behind something valuable: dozens of transcriptions, theories, and diagrams that modern researchers now draw upon when discussing the Green Children. His notes, now stored grudgingly at a local museum archive, contain a level of detail and earnest obsession that makes you wonder, What if he wasn't entirely wrong? Because here's the strange part. Several of his cave surveys match parts of now-confirmed Roman tunnel systems in East Anglia, and some of his mineral samples, tested much later, do in fact suggest water tables rich in iron sulfide, a compound that can tint skin yellow-green in high enough concentrations. It's not proof, but it's something. Which brings us full circle to the enduring question, is the truth about Agnes buried underground, or buried in people like Lambert, who just refused to look away? In the end, the Reverend didn't discover St. Martin's Land. He didn't meet another green child. He died in his sleep at 76, clutching a bean pod and smiling according to his niece, who once again left academia for beekeeping. But maybe, just maybe, his legacy wasn't in what he found. It was in the idea that sometimes stories that sound impossible still deserve to be chased, even if you look a little ridiculous doing it. Now that we've explored the Reverend's rabbit hole, or bean tunnel, if you will, let's rewind the story and return to the most pressing question skeptics have been chewing on for centuries. Who were the Woolpit children? Really? Sure. Agnes claimed she came from a twilight kingdom underground, lit only by dusk and decorated by the world's largest bean supply. But if we peel back the mystery gently, like a boiled turnip, what hard evidence is left? What if the story is less about portals and more about politics, trauma, and very poor travel decisions? Let's entertain a non-magical theory that's been proposed again and again by historians with fewer bean-based agendas. The Woolpit children were Flemish refugees. Now, hear them out. Around the time of the children's appearance, likely between 1150 and 1170, the region was going through some spicy political turmoil. King Stephen and Empress Matilda were involved in a civil war cheerfully called the Anarchy, and England was about as stable as a medieval chair missing 2 legs, and also on fire. Add to that the fact that many Flemish immigrants had settled in the East Anglia region and surrounding counties. These Flemish folk brought with them new customs, unfamiliar dialects, and very suspicious textile skills. Some locals viewed them as outsiders. Others just didn't like how they smelled. As a result, tensions flared. In 1173, a massacre of Flemish immigrants occurred during a rebellion led by the Earl of Leicester. It's entirely plausible that families were displaced, communities scattered, and children lost in the chaos. Children who, let's say, wandered into the woods, malnourished, terrified, and dressed in unfamiliar clothes. Sound familiar? And here's your required true historical detail. Medieval England's landscape was riddled with sunken roads, ravines, chalk pits, and even ancient mining tunnels that had long since collapsed or become overgrown. It was entirely possible for a child to stumble through one of these emerging days, later in a field, and wondering why everyone was speaking West Suffolk. So, what if Agnes and her brother were just 2 Flemish kids who had survived a massacre, wandered through unknown terrain, and were suffering from extreme malnutrition, enterochlorosis, also called the green sickness? This real historical condition caused by iron deficiency, anemia, and starvation was especially common in young girls. Symptoms included pale, yellow-green skin, fatigue, and a fondness for weird cravings. Hello? Raw beans. And without medical care, it could absolutely kill a young boy already weak from hunger and trauma, which makes this theory awfully compelling. You have green-tinged skin, strange clothes, gibberish language actually just a foreign dialect, terrified expressions in broad daylight. But there's still a problem. Actually, a few. First, Agnes's story never changed. If she had been from a Flemish village, why didn't she eventually recognize English society for what it was? Why didn't her dialect shift naturally back to familiarity? And how do you explain her consistent references to a place without sunlight? Second, there's the matter of the bells. Agnes always said the children were herding animals when they heard bells and followed them. Some suggest this could have been actual church bells from a distant abbey. But the way she described them, luring, rhythmic, hypnotic, feels less like Sunday Mass and more like something else. And third Flemish children wouldn't have considered wool-wearing villagers so alien. If anything, Agnes described the world of Woolpit like someone who had never seen sun or sky or wheat before. That goes beyond culture shock. That's existential panic. Which brings us back to the uncomfortable middle ground. What if both stories are true? Maybe the Woolpit children were displaced from a real, physical location, but that place was isolated, enclosed, and culturally unique enough that to them, England might as well have been another planet. Imagine a hidden commune, a forgotten religious sect, a self-sufficient group living in semi-darkness in a valley or ravine, deliberately apart from the world. It sounds bizarre, but history is full of examples. Hermits, anchorites, cave-dwelling monks, people who chose seclusion as a spiritual discipline. Could St. Martin's Land have been one of those? Some scholars have proposed that the children's original home was a sunken valley shrouded in fog, where twilight persisted because of the geography deep in the folds of the land, with mist filtering the daylight and giving everything a dim, surreal glow. If the locals lived underground or in cliffside caves, the sensation would feel literally like a different world. And in that context, the green skin, odd language, and clothes all make sense without invoking elves, aliens, or rips in the time-space bean continuum. Still, Agnes insisted her world was not just shadowed, it was entirely sunless, a place without day or night, just a dim, endless light. And no matter how many skeptical monks raised an eyebrow, she never changed her tune. Which leaves us with two options. She was lying with incredible discipline, for no personal gain, for her entire life. Or she was telling the truth, as she understood it. And here's your philosophical debate of the chapter, is truth objective, or is it filtered through the reality a person perceives? If Agnes believed in her twilight world, does that make it any less real? It's the old Ship of Theseus problem, but with slightly more chlorophyll. And here's your quirky off-topic detail to lighten the mood. In 16th century England, there was a genuine debate about whether moss was a food group. Some monks claimed it was spiritually neutral and could be eaten during fasting. Others argued it was a vegetable of deceit. So yes, people were out here defending salad from a theological angle. Back to Woolpit. In the end, the Flemish theory logical, data-supported, and absolutely plausible remains one of the least satisfying options. Not because it's dull, but because it robs the story of its glow, its eerie quiet, its lingering sense that somewhere, just beyond the fog, there's a place where the sun never rises and children eat raw beans like candy. And even if that place doesn't exist on any map, it lives on in the story. And in the next section, we're going to explore how the story changed and how the world began to change it back. Because once the legends took over, the truth became harder to see than ever. Once upon a not-so-sunlit time, two green children wandered into a Suffolk village, and that should have been the end of it. A blip. A strange footnote in England's long, damp, wolf-infested history. But stories have a way of sticking. They mutate. They evolve. They get told in candle-lit kitchens and poorly lit taverns, and then centuries later get repackaged as bedtime tales or clickbait documentaries. Because what began as a curious chronicle from a few medieval monks somehow bloomed into something bigger. The tale of the Green Children wasn't just preserved. It was remixed, romanticized, and eventually repurposed into folklore. And that's where things get wonderfully complicated. Let's start with the facts. Or, facts. The earliest accounts came from William of Newburgh, writing in the late 1100s, and Ralph of Coggeshall, a few decades later. They both reference the same story: green kids. Strange language, tragic ending, but from slightly different angles. William seemed more skeptical. Ralph a bit more mystical, but neither treated it like total fiction. They placed the story in real towns, near real landmarks, involving real people. This wasn't a fable in a vacuum. It was local history, with a side of magical realism. But over time, those hard edges got sanded down. By the 14th century, the Woolpit kids were showing up in fairy lore collections, often renamed, retold, and thoroughly enchanted. The story became a moral parable. Don't stray too far from home. Don't follow strange sounds in the forest. And definitely don't eat only beans. Which honestly seems like good advice across the board. Then, by the Victorian era, the story underwent its biggest transformation, yet it got romanticized. Because the Victorians loved two things: weird little children with mysterious origins. Pretending everything had a deeper spiritual metaphor, they started casting the Green Children not as accidental immigrants or sickly kids, but as actual fae folk, creatures of another realm, maybe even fallen angels, depending on how gothic your literary journal was that month. Agnes and her brother were no longer confused kids from a strange place. They were now messengers, portents, eerie symbols of something lost. Innocence. Wonder chlorophyll. Take your pick. Victorian painters depicted them as wayfish, glowing figures with oversized eyes and luminous green skin. Think pre-Raphaelite fairies with beanbags. One painting titled Children of the Hollow Hills shows them holding hands under a sickle moon, staring mournfully at a world that doesn't understand them. Which brings us to your quirky off-topic detail of the section. The Victorians were also obsessed with seances, and at least 2 recorded medium sessions in London tried to contact the spirits of the Green Children. One medium claimed to have spoken with the boy, who allegedly said it was always twilight. Then the medium fainted dramatically, and everyone applauded. But even outside of ghost circles, the story got traction. Woolpit became a kind of accidental pilgrimage site for those fascinated by mystery. Tourists arrived hoping to see the famous wolf pits, now mostly filled in and unremarkable, and to ask the locals questions like, "Where exactly did the children stand when they entered your dimension?" To which the locals replied, "Do you want tea or not?" Still, the tale persisted, and like all good folklore, it shapeshifted to fit the times. In the 20th century, the rise of science fiction gave the story yet another identity. Suddenly, scholars and writers began wondering, what if Agnes wasn't a fairy, or a refugee, but a time traveler, or an alien, or both? Enter authors like Duncan Lunan, who proposed that the children were extraterrestrial castaways, accidentally teleported from a planet in orbit around a binary star. According to this theory, the green skin was a reaction to Earth's oxygen-rich atmosphere, and the twilight world was just the dim light of their home suns. Admittedly, this theory is roughly as plausible as explaining pigeons by calling them failed weather drones. But Lunan made some compelling narrative leaps. His version was thrilling, elegant, and extremely popular on the 1970s lecture circuit, and thus began a wave of speculative retellings, books, short stories. And yes, YouTube videos began recasting the Green Children as dimensional travelers, quantum flukes, or even psychic experiments gone wrong. The once sad, quiet tale of 2 strange kids lost in Suffolk became a genre playground, ranging from fairy horror to interstellar tragedy. And while none of these reinterpretations can be called historical, they do speak to something deeper. The story of the Green Children is so sticky, so unnerving, because it lives at the crossroads of genres. It's not quite fantasy, not exactly folklore. It's not even a ghost story. It just is. It's a narrative liminal space, a place where our definitions blur, where truth and myth overlap, where you're not sure whether to feel wonder or sadness, or just deeply unsettled. And that leads us to this section's philosophical musing, TM. Is the power of a story based on whether it's real or whether it feels like it should be? Because let's face it, the tale of 2 green kids, one dead, one slowly humanizing, from a sunless land no one can find. It's the kind of narrative that hooks your brain like Velcro. Whether it's fact, fiction, or some tangled DNA strand of both it sticks. And that's why the story kept growing, because no version fully explains it. The skeptics can't debunk it. The believers can't prove it. The folklorists can't agree on its origins. And the local Woolpit pub still sells Twilight Ale with a picture of 2 green kids on the label, which just raises more questions. But before we go full alien podcast on you, let's pause for a minute, because up until now, we've focused on what other people did with the story. Next, we're going to look at something more haunting, what Agnes herself became, in the years that followed, not as a mystery, but as a person living under the weight of one. Time has a strange way of sanding down the edges of a person until all that's left is a shape, something that fits neatly into a story, but barely resembles the living, breathing human who once filled it. And that's exactly what happened to Agnes. Over the centuries, she became the Green Girl, the Bean Eater, the child of St. Martin's Land, the one who stayed. A walking question mark wrapped in folklore and salt pork. But before the legends fully took her, before artists made her eyes twice the size of normal and authors turned her into a space princess, she was quite simply a woman, living, working, trying to be normal. And from what little we know, it didn't exactly go smoothly. Let's talk about adult Agnes, the version history tried to bury under mythology, but left small, surprising footprints behind. After her brother's death, and her own slow acclimation to normal society, or as normal as 12th century England got, Agnes was baptized and adopted into the household of Sir Richard de Calne. Over time, she grew fluent in English, learned domestic skills, and was gradually integrated into the manor's staff. By all accounts, she was intelligent, obedient, and not overly social. People noticed. There were no reports of her causing trouble, but there were murmurs. Even decades later, records refer to her in vague terms. A will from the 13th century names an Agnes, once of Woolpit, now of Lynn, who inherited a modest dowry and a spindle wheel. Not exactly thrilling evidence, but enough to link her to a quiet life spent in King's Lynn, a bustling port town not far from her origin pit. And here's your real historical nugget of the section. King's Lynn was one of the most important ports in medieval England. It had trade routes across Europe, a network of Hanseatic merchants, and more than its share of colorful characters. It was also home to a thriving population of Flemish settlers' refugees, artisans, and translators. Could it be that Agnes felt more at home there? That something in the language, the food, or even the architecture reminded her of whatever half-lit place she'd once called home? We'll never know for sure, but the speculation is delicious, and here's your quirky sidebar to pair with it. One old tavern record in King's Lynn lists a green Agnes as having run up a small tab, 4 pints of cider, and 2 bowls of boiled peas. Is it her? Is it some other peapod enthusiast? We'll never know. But the nickname stuck in the margin, a little green shadow in the ink. What we do know is this Agnes married. She was wed to a man named Richard Barr, a minor official with ties to the royal court. Some believe he was a clerk or legal administrator. Others say he was a merchant. In either case, it was a respectable match, especially for someone who had once frightened villagers by asking for beans in a mysterious language. They may have had children. No records survive to prove it definitively. But oral traditions in Lynn mention descendants with foreign eyes or strange skin that darkened in the winter. Take that as you will. Maybe it was just seasonal eczema, or maybe a bit of St. Martin's Land lingered in her bloodline. But despite this semblance of normalcy, Agnes never really escaped her own legend. There's a moment recorded in a 14th century parish note, an otherwise boring administrative document where a priest visiting from Ely refers to a local woman as that one who speaks of the hollow world. He doesn't name her, but the time frame, the town, and the phrasing strongly hint he meant Agnes, decades after her arrival, she was still being whispered about. And here comes your philosophical debate of the chapter time. If people never stop seeing you as a mystery, can you ever truly become yourself? Agnes likely spent her whole life with one foot in each world. Not the worlds of England and St. Martin's Land, per se, but the worlds of belief and reality, of how she saw herself and how others projected their own myths onto her. To some, she was evidence of magic. To others, a refugee. To a few, like Sir Richard, she was simply a child who needed care. But to herself, we don't know. She never wrote, never recorded her thoughts. Her life was a string of second-hand quotes and interpretations, except one. In a rare instance preserved by an anonymous scribe, she was asked perhaps jokingly whether she missed her home, and Agnes replied, "There are some places you leave, but they do not leave you." It's a poetic line, maybe too poetic. Maybe it was edited later. Or maybe, just maybe, Agnes had learned to say profound things when people stopped asking real questions. And here's your offbeat detail of the day. In some parts of medieval Europe, people believed certain individuals could carry the memory of other worlds in their dreams, visions passed down through blood or fate. These people were called Twilight Walkers, not witches, not prophets, just people who didn't forget. If that term had existed in Woolpit, Agnes would have worn it perfectly. And so, as she aged, faded from attention, and eventually died, date unknown, burial place unmarked, the girl from the Green Land disappeared the way all people do, quietly, gradually, without ceremony. But her story that was just beginning, because as the years passed, the myth of the Green Children started to grow teeth. And in the next section, we'll dive into what happens when a gentle village legend gets picked apart by modern minds, twisted by cultural obsessions, and finally offered up to the one place where all mysteries go to live forever, the Internet. The Internet is where facts go to stretch their legs, get dressed in tin foil, and maybe pick up a few conspiracy tattoos along the way. It's also the place where stories like the Green Children of Woolpit find their second or fifth life. Once a peculiar local legend scribbled by a couple of medieval monks, the tale has now been uploaded, downloaded, animated, dramatized, turned into TikToks, ASMR videos, alien forums, Tumblr poems, Dungeons & Dragons side quests, and at least one very questionable Etsy candle. Because, as it turns out, the algorithm loves a good mystery, and the Woolpit children, they're algorithm gold. Let's take a look at how this centuries-old curiosity managed to thrive in the most unlikely of places, the age of Wi-Fi and memes. First up, we've got the YouTubers, many of whom have taken the story and run with it like medieval bards with GoPros. There are documentaries featuring mood music and digitally enhanced green skin overlays. There are narrators with soothing voices who whisper things like, "But what if the children were never human to begin with," before cutting to ominous drone footage of rural Suffolk. Some creators treat the tale like historical mystery. Others frame it as a modern X-Files episode. One particularly popular video proposes that Agnes and her brother were victims of a government time travel experiment that went sideways in the 12th century, which, while wildly anachronistic, somehow has over 1 million views. Reddit, predictably, is where things get both spicy and unhinged. Subreddits like r/gr Unresolved Mysteries, r Paranormal, and r Glitch in The Matrix have all hosted threads dissecting the Green Children. Theories range from plausible to pasta-brained. Among the more popular ones, they were alien hybrids dropped off for observation. They were quantum hitchhikers who slipped into our world via a multiversal tear. The Twilight was an alternate simulation rendering issue. Like, they spawned in the wrong instance of Earth. One user simply wrote, "They were sent by the beans." No explanation. Just that. And then, of course, you've got the Twitter armchair historians, who mostly engage with the tale in meme format. One viral tweet read, "Just found out 2 green kids appeared in England once, refused to eat anything but beans, and claimed to be from the land of St. Martin." Honestly, mood. Honestly. This, strangely, is one of the most accurate summaries on the internet. But behind the humor and the conspiracies, the digital retellings reveal something deeper, a craving for stories that don't have neat endings. In a world dominated by timelines, spoilers, plot twists, and explained videos, the Green Children represent something beautifully unexplainable. They aren't a call to action. They're not a morality play. They're just weird, in that old world, slow-burning. Wait, what kind of way? And that's a rare kind of narrative these days. Still, with renewed attention comes renewed confusion, because as more people try to research the story, they quickly run into a minefield of contradictory sources, missing documents, and interpretive chaos. Example. Some sources say the children came from a cave, others say a valley. Some claim the green faded after eating regular food, others say it never fully left. Even Agnes's name. Not in the original texts. That came centuries later from oral tradition, which is medieval history's version of playing telephone after 6 ales. And let's not even get into the location drama. Woolpit is a real place. Yes, you can visit it. There's a sign. There's a pub. But the exact location of where the children appeared, that's up for grabs. Some say it was the western field near the old church ruins. Others insist it was the now demolished edge of the forest where the wolf pits once sat. In the absence of definitive landmarks, theorists have tried to reconstruct the mystery using everything from geological maps to folklore surveys to Google Earth. Which brings us to your true academic detail of the Section 1 2006 linguistic analysis. Cross-referenced the supposed language the children spoke with early Flemish dialects, and came up with 0 overlap. Another study compared the legend to changelings in Irish folklore, noting striking similarities: children who disappear and reappear, often altered, sometimes glowing, always wrong. That leads to this section's philosophical quandary. In a world where information is infinite, is the absence of a clear answer more terrifying or more comforting? Some believe stories like the Green Children endure because they remain blurry at the edges. They must stay unsolved to retain their power, like constellations that only look like animals if you don't look too closely. Of course, the internet also encourages people to solve the unsolvable. Every Reddit post starts the same way. Okay, hear me out. And then you're down another rabbit hole, where someone's linking 12th century Suffolk to Mayan mythology via beans, magnetism, and moon phases. But maybe that's okay, because even the most bonkers interpretations reveal something very human. We want the story to mean something. We want Agnes and her brother to be more than a village rumor or an unsolved death. We want there to be a door back to St. Martin's land. A clue we missed. A portal we could still find if we just think about it hard enough at 2:47 a.m. Even if it's just for the thrill of maybe. And speaking of lost doors and overlooked clues, there's something else the internet has stumbled upon. Something that was almost forgotten entirely. A set of old church records that suggest the Green Children weren't the only ones who arrived that way. But that's a tale for the next section. So before we go galloping off into whispered archives and unindexed pages, just ask yourself this. If 2 green children could step into our world unnoticed for centuries, who says they were the last Vakirchis? Here's the thing about medieval church records. They're the historical equivalent of your grandmother's attic. You go in expecting mothballs and yellowing hymnals, and you come out with a human tooth in a coin purse labeled for emergencies. In other words, they're weird, messy, and occasionally explosive. And in the case of the Green Children of Woolpit, it turns out there may have been more than one sighting. Or, at the very least, more than one incident that smells suspiciously similar. In 1998, a quietly obsessed folklorist named Dr. Elsie Harding, while elbow-deep in the diocesan records of Ely, came across a handful of curious notations from the 13th and 14th centuries. These weren't full-blown narratives or glowing testimonials, just scribbled marginalia, funeral annotations, and an absolute gem of a phrase in Latin that roughly translates to, "Another arrived, green and sobbing. If your spine just tingled, congratulations, you're one of us now. Let's back up." Dr. Harding was researching church punishments for rural heresy, like refusing to plant turnips in the right shape, when she found references to several individuals described as not of the local tongue, dull of eye, green of cheek, wandered from the bell mound with clothes of glimmer thread. None of these were complete sentences. Most weren't even clearly connected. But taken together, they hinted at something unsettling. Woolpit may not have been an isolated case. Now, to be clear, these findings have never been officially authenticated. Dr. Harding presented her paper at a relatively obscure folklore symposium, where it was politely ignored in favor of a heated debate about fairy horses. But to those who actually read it, the implications were undeniable. Because if her interpretation is correct, then at least 3 other churches in eastern England recorded children or youths with unexplained green skin, strange clothing, and incoherent speech spanning a century after the Woolpit event. One entry, from 1294 in Lavenham, reads, "A youth not known came crying from the pit by the beech grove, barefoot and dull-eyed. He did not take bread, only roots, and died before sunfall." Another, in 1322 from Bungay, "The widow claims her daughter's cousin was taken by light and returned green and mad. Baptism, not permitted." These could be misunderstandings. They could be metaphors. They could be the result of rampant cholera, poor lighting, or a suspicious turnip. But they also might not be. Here's your true historical detail of the chapter. In the High Middle Ages, epidemics of ergot poisoning caused by a fungus on rye bread could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and greenish-tinged skin. The afflicted were often labeled as fairy-touched or hexed, particularly if they spoke gibberish. So yes, there's a grim, fungal explanation, but ergot doesn't explain the language, or the consistent reference to emerging from pits or caves, or the refusal to eat common food. And it definitely doesn't explain the bells. Because that motif, it's not just in Agnes's tale anymore. One scribbled confession undated, but attributed to a monk in Ely, mentions a child of wind and copper, lost to us by chime. The term chime here seems to refer to bell ringing, but it's placed with such reverence, such symbolism, that folklorists now wonder if the bell wasn't just a sound. Maybe it was a signal, a threshold, a cue. In the medieval world, bells marked times of prayer, funerals, births, danger, and divine presence. To hear a bell and follow it into another realm is straight-up fairy lore 101. It's also the linchpin in Agnes's story, the moment her world changed. So if these other sightings are even partially true, we're not just talking about a strange girl with a tragic past. We're talking about a pattern, which leads to this section's philosophical dilemma. How many times must something strange occur before we stop calling it an anomaly and start calling it a system? Because maybe the Woolpit children weren't the only ones. Maybe they were just the ones who survived long enough to talk. And here's your quirky off-topic fact. Because otherwise, this gets too existential. In 15th century Europe, there was a documented belief that cheese could cure nightmares, not prevent them, cure them. You had to sleep with a small wedge under your tongue, chew it upon waking, and spit it at the nearest wall. If the wall cracked, demon gone. If not, try harder cheese. This isn't totally unrelated, because medieval logic worked like that. If children came back green, or raving, or unwashed and glowing, they were treated with the same wild combinations of faith, folklore, and food experiments. Agnes got lucky. Others didn't. Which raises the haunting question. How many Agneses never learned English? How many died, nameless, green-skinned, and dismissed as ill? How many were just lost again? Dr. Harding's research never got published in a major journal. She passed away in 2010, leaving behind several handwritten notebooks, one of which simply reads, "On the inside cover, Agnes was not alone." And maybe that's the key, because the story we've followed so far has been about a girl from nowhere. But what if we've been wrong this whole time? What if Woolpit wasn't the beginning of a mystery? What if it was the end of a migration? By now, we've followed the breadcrumbs through folklore, famine, fungal hallucinations, and at least 2 ghostly bell chimes. And the question hanging in the air like stale incense is this: what if the Green Children weren't the strange ones? No, really, what if we've had it backwards the whole time? What if Agnes and her brother were normal for where they came from? And it's us, bright-lit, wheat-chomping surface dwellers who are the anomaly. Because the more you look at the story through this inverted lens, the more it starts to shift. Like one of those pictures that's either a duck or a rabbit, depending on how sleep-deprived you are. Let's talk about St. Martin's Land again. By medieval standards, it sounds like a fairy tale, but let's unpack it like rational weirdos. A place, beneath the surface, dimly lit eternal twilight, populated by peaceful, green-skinned people, with its own rules, diet, and rhythm, separated from our world by a tunnel, or cave, or rupture, entered or exited by accident. Congratulations, you've just described nearly every hidden people myth in global folklore. The Irish have Tir na Nog, where time moves slowly and you age the second you leave. The Norse had Svartalfheimr, the home of the subterranean dark elves. The Japanese have Takamagahara, a realm above and apart. Even the Aztecs had Chikomoztoc, the legendary 7 caves from which their ancestors emerged. Different continents, different names, same blueprint. And now we arrive at our ongoing academic debate of the section, Are Hidden Realms simply metaphorical stories to explain the unknown? Or are they distorted memories of real places that once existed and are now lost? Folklorist Marcia Wynne posited a theory in the early 2000s that the St. Martin's Land story might be a faded cultural memory of an isolated ancient society, one that lived apart, underground or deep in valleys, and that only rarely, tragically, interacted with the outside world. She called them the dusk societies, not literal mole people or magic cave dwellers, but microcultures cut off from sunlight, modern language, and large-scale agriculture. And before you roll your eyes, remember there are real anthropological examples of isolated subterranean or cave-dwelling communities, especially during times of war, plague, or religious persecution. Entire families have lived for generations in mountain tunnels, cliffside dens, and volcanic craters. It's not magic, it's survival. And if enough generations go by, that isolation becomes culture. Different food, different light, different stories. It's not hard to imagine such a group developing green-tinged skin from diet or water exposure. It's not hard to believe they'd grow sensitive to sunlight, and it's not hard to believe that, if a few children wandered out and were met with suspicion or confusion, they might not survive long enough to be remembered, except for one, Agnes. Now here's your weirdly specific historical tidbit of the day. In 1384, a farmer in Norfolk wrote in his weather diary, "Yes, that was a thing. A girl was seen again with bark-colored hands and a strange breath." Scholars often interpret this as rural superstition or poetic flair. But bark-colored was occasionally used to describe olive or greenish complexions, especially among the unwashed or the unfamiliar. More importantly, this wasn't recorded as gossip. It was filed with weather events, same page as hail and early frost, a sign of something rare, unsettling, and real enough to log. So if Wynne and other researchers are correct, Zikauna, Martin's Land, may have been one of many pockets hidden worlds, not beneath the surface in a magical sense, but geographically, sociologically, functionally. And these pockets didn't vanish. They were absorbed, flattened, forgotten, processed by time the way rough stones become smooth in a stream, which leads us to this slightly uncomfortable but oddly thrilling conclusion. Agnes didn't come from another world. She came from this one, just a forgotten corner, one that didn't survive contact. So what do we make of that, if St. Martin's Land was real? Just another forgotten village or subterranean society? Does that make the story less magical or more human? That's your philosophical boomerang of the section. Because sometimes, it's easier to believe in fairy realms than it is to face the quiet tragedy of lost people. And this brings us to our quirky off-topic moment. Because it's been a heavy few paragraphs in medieval Europe. It was believed that a child who sneezed 7 times in a row was either possessed, blessed, or destined to marry into royalty. No in between. In some cases, parents would record the sneeze count like lottery numbers. Back to Agnes. As time passed and her story was spun into legend, her actual experience may have been buried under centuries of metaphor. But underneath all the interpretations, there's a single thread that never breaks. She remembered the twilight, the bells, the tunnel, the quiet. And she never once changed her story, not for money, not for fame, not even for acceptance. So maybe she didn't need a new world. Maybe she just needed someone to believe hers had existed. And if she came from a people who were once here and have since vanished, well, that makes us the strangers now. By now, we've wandered through dusty manuscripts, folklore tangents, questionable cheese rituals, and enough speculative anthropology to make a grad student cry. But despite the legend's endless retellings, its strongest thread might just be the simplest one. A girl came from somewhere else, and she never stopped saying so. But the true power of Agnes's story lies in the evidence that didn't vanish. Or at least, not entirely. Let's talk about church records, linguistic clues, and forgotten towns. Because while the narrative often slips into twilighty myth, the historical breadcrumbs keep pulling us back to the idea that something real happened in or near Woolpit. Starting with a map. In 1903, an antiquarian named Theophilus Greenhow, yes, hilariously, Greenhow published a reprint of an obscure 13th century tax ledger. Tucked in the margins was a short, cryptic note beside a now-lost settlement named Fornham All Saints Minor. Land, granted to the girl Agnes, once of the Bell Valley. Bell Valley, not Woolpit, not Twilight Kingdom. Just Bell Valley. Now, to most medieval clerks, that's a throwaway phrase. But to anyone who's studied Agnes's story, that's a loaded term. It matches her description of hearing bells while tending animals, and emerging from a valley into bright light. Here's your verified historical fact. The area between Woolpit and Fornham was once densely wooded, with rolling chalk valleys and at least 2 abandoned monastic sites. One of these sites, near the now-vanished hamlet of Thistledown Hollow, reportedly had a bell tower fallen into earth. Records suggest a collapse occurred sometime in the late 1100s. Could Agnes and her brother have emerged from there? Some believe so. In fact, several linguistic researchers have pored over regional dialects, looking for clues in how Agnes might have described her home before she knew English. One old record says she referred to it as Martin le Vay, which could be a corruption of Martin of the Vale, or possibly Valley of St. Martin. This has fueled theories that her home wasn't some mystical plain, but a valley-bound monastic farming commune, perhaps dedicated to St. Martin, perhaps isolated enough that the children had limited exposure to daylight and spoke an unfamiliar form of Anglo-Flemish or Latinized dialect. It's not glamorous, but it's plausible. Add in a cave-in or a tunnel collapse, a desperate crawl toward bells heard in the distance from Woolpit's church tower, and 2 terrified kids stumbling into the sun, weak, confused, and speaking a language no villager could decipher. Suddenly, everything starts to click. The green hue malnutrition, or long-term exposure to mineral-rich groundwater. The strange clothes, monastic robes, misinterpreted by rural eyes. The gibberish language obscure Latin or French dialect, warped by trauma and age. And here's your offbeat, yet relevant detail of the section Medieval England had at least 40 saints named Martin. Local monasteries often chose St. Martin of Tours as a patron because of his popularity, and get this, his reputation for traveling between realms, both earthly and divine. So even the name of Agnes's alleged homeland might have been real, just misremembered, like a half-dream you keep trying to explain over breakfast. But here's where things twist, because while records occasionally offer fragments like this, they also show signs of something stranger intentional omission in at least 2 surviving church ledgers. Later annotations have been crossed out or burned through, as if someone tried to erase all mention of the Green Girl or the Bell Valley. One scholar called it a targeted clerical redaction, which is historian speak for somebody definitely tried to cover something up. Why? Here's your philosophical hand grenade, TM. Do we erase inconvenient stories because they're dangerous, or because they're true? Agnes's story wasn't threatening, but it was destabilizing. It hinted at worlds adjacent to our own, cultures within shouting distance of civilization that no one had bothered to map. People who lived in silence, emerged by accident, and were met with confusion instead of compassion. In a society built on order, lineage, and religious structure, that kind of story was an itch, which is why it may have been buried not out of malice, but discomfort. The same way we file away strange dreams or things we saw out of the corner of our eye. But even buried things leave traces. And in the case of Agnes, the linguistic evidence is compelling. Several medieval scholars point out that her first known phrases, once translated, include not just references to twilight and the valley, but to the Old Green, a term whose meaning is debated. Some think it's literal her skin. Others believe it refers to a place, possibly a location in her homeland, possibly a philosophical state, the green world, the before. Even now, the Old Green has become a poetic term used in certain folklore circles. It's what you feel when you hear a story that stirs something ancient in you. It's the place you almost remember. And maybe that's the whole point of this story. Agnes may have come from a forgotten commune, or a lost valley, or an underground society that simply vanished without fanfare. Or maybe she came from somewhere we still haven't dared to name. But what matters is she came from somewhere, and she remembered, and in the next section, we'll follow her to her final years where memory, myth, and legacy finally collide. Because for someone who spent her life trying to explain the unexplainable, Agnes didn't leave quietly. Agnes lived a long life long enough, in fact, for people to forget that she once terrified an entire village simply by existing. Long enough for the edges of her story to fade, but not so long that she ever truly escaped it. By the time she reached her later years, she had stopped trying to explain herself. The world had chosen what she was: a mystery, a curiosity, maybe a miracle, maybe a mistake. Agnes had learned that it was easier to smile, to nod, to say yes from the green place, and then go back to shelling peas. She lived in King's Lynn, where most people just knew her as Agnes of Woolpit, a nickname that somehow carried both affection and avoidance. She had a small home near the edge of the market square, close enough to hear the bustle, far enough to keep her distance. She worked, she cooked, she attended church, she raised a daughter, possibly 2, and though there are no official birth records, several scribes noted that Agnes left lineage, which is about as exciting as medieval birth announcements get. She grew older, like anyone does, slowly, subtly, then, all at once. Her knees ached, her eyesight faded, but her memory, sharp as ever. Visitors came occasionally, scribes, scholars, curious friars with questionable mustaches hoping to speak to the woman from St. Martin's land. Some were kind, some were condescending. One tried to offer her money to confess it was all a story. She laughed so hard she choked on her broth, because Agnes didn't need to convince anyone anymore. She had lived a life, a full one, by most standards. But late in her days, She began to tell her story again, not to historians or priests, but to children, neighborhood kids, grandchildren, strays and orphans. Anyone small enough to still believe in things that didn't need proof. She would gather them in her garden, under a crooked pear tree, and tell them about the soft world. A world with no sun, but plenty of light, where the wind hummed instead of howled, where people were kind, food grew in long rows of vines, and no one ever shouted. The children didn't care if it was real. They just wanted to know, what did it smell like. She told them it smelled like wet stone and green beans. And one girl whispered, "That sounds like my grandma's basement." Agnes smiled. "Maybe your grandma came from there too." And here's your true historical footnote. A 15th century manuscript held in Cambridge includes a brief, anonymous poem that seems to reference Agnes not by name, but unmistakably. The Green Maid walked, her past unspun, her home below a hollow sun. She bore no truth to quiet the din, for truth, once told, is locked within. It's unsigned. It never became famous. But it suggests that decades or even centuries later, people were still thinking about her not as a fraud or a fable, but as a kind of living riddle, a person-shaped question with no clear answer. In her final year, Agnes began losing strength. She stayed indoors more, watched the clouds from her window, and spoke less. The townsfolk said she had gone quiet again, as if she were fading back into the soft world from which she came. Her daughter tended to her. Occasionally, the parish priest stopped by, and once, late in winter, a scribe from the abbey asked if she would share her story one last time. Agnes looked at him, smiled weakly, and said, "You already know it? You just want me to change it." She died shortly after that. No fanfare. No funeral of bells and banners. Just a quiet burial behind the chapel. No stone. No inscription. But stories don't need graves, because a few generations later, the children of King's Lynn would still whisper about the green woman who came from the place where the sun doesn't rise. And here's your quirky closing fact of the section. There's a plant native to East Anglia known as Agnes's vine, a local nickname for a creeping green herb that grows only in damp, shaded places. Botanists call it Glaucoma heterachea. Villagers just call it the child's root. Coincidence? Absolutely. Or maybe not, because in the next and final part, we'll sit back, breathe a little slower, and walk with Agnes one last time. After all, you've come this far. In her final days, Agnes spent more time asleep than awake, but when she did wake, usually in the hour just before dawn, she would stare at the far wall of her small cottage, eyes half closed, as though watching a memory replay in silence. No one knows what she saw. A boy's face, a bean field, the mouth of a tunnel, the first blinding sunlight, or maybe just the color green. The story of Agnes didn't end with her death. That's the trick with stories like these, they refuse to stay buried. They breathe under floorboards and whisper between pages. They survive in the mouths of strangers who don't even realize they're repeating something centuries old. She became a myth, then a question, then an echo, and somewhere along the line, Agnes stopped being a person and became a place, a kind of idea you carry with you, a name you give to the feeling of not quite belonging, of standing in the middle of a bright world and remembering what made of shadows and silence. Some people call it homesickness, others call it grief. Maybe it's just memory doing its best. Modern visitors to Woolpit rarely find what they're looking for. The original wolf pits are long gone. The manor house is mostly rubble beneath a newer farmhouse. There's no tunnel, no bell. Just a village green and a small pub that sells postcards of two suspiciously cheerful green children holding hands. But if you ask the locals, the really old ones, the ones who've been there long enough to stop questioning odd things, they'll sometimes lower their voices and say, "You know, she really was green." Right. As if color could explain everything. As if a hue of the skin could unravel centuries of forgetting. And here's the thing that keeps scholars up at night. Long after they've closed the manuscripts and silenced the YouTube tabs, Agnes never changed her story. Not once, not ever. In a time when people would rewrite their pasts for a crust of bread or a nod from a noble, she held to hers with quiet certainty. It's easy to laugh at that. Easier to explain it away. Trauma, language barriers, hunger, infection, fairy tales, fungal spores, Flemish dialects. But there's a small, dangerous part of us that wonders, what if she was right? What if, just beneath the hills, or within the folds of mist, or curled at the edges of our sleep, there's still a place like St. Martin's Land. A place of twilight and soft voices. A place where the sun doesn't shine, but it doesn't need to. And what if someone out there remembers the way back? Maybe we don't need to find the tunnel. Maybe we've walked past it 100 times, too focused on real estate or signal bars to notice the stone worn smooth from centuries of quiet feet. Maybe that's where stories like Agnes's live now, not underground, but just outside the corner of our eye. And when you're lying in bed at night, on the edge of sleep, listening to your heartbeat echo in the silence, there's a part of your mind that still wonders, could I find it if I listened hard enough? Maybe the bells are still ringing. Maybe the beans are still growing. Maybe the children are still watching, just waiting for us to believe again.